The warden died the night before the one inspection that would have exposed everything. Someone had been stealing from a charity for the elderly for 15 years, laundering money through the innocent guise of the church flower fund. The thief was the person everyone in the parish trusted most, the vicar's wife. It was an ordinary theft, born of desperation and sustained by habit. A single, leather-bound visitor's book at the almshouse entrance would prove it all. The perfection of her deception was exactly what gave her away. "I'm Jack, this is Midnight Pages from Ohio. Welcome in. Pull up a chair." Tonight's story takes us to a quiet English market town where charity and theft walk hand in hand. It's a story about how easily a good intention can curdle into a lifelong habit, and how the smallest details, a change in ink, a slip date, can unravel decades of careful deception. Let's open the book. Chapter 1: The Book by the Door. Brinely Magna is one of those quiet English market towns where time seems to pool and settle rather than flow. At its heart stands St. Bartholomew's Parish Church, its flint walls weathered by centuries of rain, anchoring the cobbled market square where the smell of old stones, damp earth, and wood smoke lingers in the autumn air. Attached to the church, forming a neat three-sided courtyard, are the Hardwick almshouses. Built in the reign of Queen and for the relief of the elderly poor, they are a row of cottages possessing the kind of picturesque charm that tourists photograph and residents find gently drafty. There is a profound sense of order here, a rhythm of life dictated by the chiming of the church clock and the slow, deliberate movements of people for whom rushing is a distant memory. Miss Jane Marple arrived in Brinely Magna on a Tuesday, visiting as a guest of a local resident, Mrs. Dora Hadley. She was treated by everyone as a harmless elderly woman, underestimated throughout her stay. The train journey from St. Mary Mead had been slow, the carriage rattling through an endless procession of damp green fields, giving Miss Marple ample time to observe her fellow passengers and knit a shapeless pink garment. Mrs. Hadley, a woman whose energy often outpaced her tact, had met her at the station. On the walk to the almshouses, Dora kept up a steady stream of chatter, detailing the ailments of the parish, the recent squabbles on the flower committee, and the unyielding exactitude of the almshouse warden. When they stepped into the courtyard, Miss Marple felt the immediate quiet of the place. The late-blooming roses climbed the brickwork, their heavy heads nodding in the breeze. The flagstones were perfectly swept. From an open window came the faint, reedy sound of a radio playing a classical concert, mingling with the gentle clatter of teacups. It was a place constructed to keep the harshness of the world at bay. Miss Marple allowed herself to be guided into the entrance hall, a dark, oak-paneled room that smelled intimately of beeswax, lavender, and old paper. There, resting on a polished mahogany table directly beneath a narrow stained-glass window, was the visitor's book. It was a substantial object, bound in heavy, dark leather that had grown soft with decades of handling. The pages emitted that particular dry, dusty scent of a book that has been opened and closed thousands of times. It had recorded every caller for 30 years. "Everyone signs it," Mrs. Hadley explained, bustling past and waving a hand. "Mr. Cartwright is very particular about it. He's the warden, you know. Keeps a very tight ship. Insists on a proper record. He says if you don't know who has crossed your threshold, you don't know your own house." Miss Marple paused by the table. She opened the heavy cover. She signed her name, her handwriting small, neat, and precise. Then, quite naturally, she turned back a page or two. The ink faded from crisp blue to brownish black as she went further back. She read the entries idly, the way someone might flip through a guest book at a country inn, admiring the different hands, noting the repetition of names. The doctor's hurried scrawl. The Vicar's looping script. The various, disciplined signatures of the Flower Committee members. It was a small, ordinary detail, this book, but Miss Marple was a woman who paid attention to ordinary details. She noticed that the entries were meticulous. She noticed the names of the regular visitors. And she noticed, tucked away in the rhythm of the signatures, something that didn't quite fit. A subtle repetition, a cadence of visits that struck her as slightly off-key. She did not name it, even to herself. She merely let the observation drop into her mind like a pebble into a deep well, waiting to see what ripples it might cause. She closed the book, smoothed her pink shawl, and followed Mrs. Hadley into the warden's office. There, they met Mr. Roland Cartwright. He was a man of 71, with the stiff, uncompromising posture of a retired military man and a face that suggested a lifetime of expecting other people to do things incorrectly. The office was an extension of the man, fiercely ordered, smelling of ink and peppermints, every pencil sharpened to a lethal point. "Mrs. Hadley," he said, rising stiffly. He looked at Miss Marple with the kind of tolerant dismissal usually reserved for a slightly confused relative. "And this is your guest. Welcome to the Hardwick Almshouses, madam. I trust you signed the book." "I did, Mr. Cartwright," Miss Marple fluttered. "Such a beautiful old volume. It must contain so much history." "It contains facts, madam," Cartwright corrected her sharply. "Facts and accountability. We are preparing for the diocesan inspection tomorrow. Mr. Frost will be arriving. I flatter myself he will find the accounts in perfect order." He tapped a thick, leather-bound ledger on his desk. "Though I must say, the Flower Fund receipts this year." He trailed off, his brow furrowing deeply, his eyes fixed on a slip of paper protruding from the ledger. "Is there a problem, Mr. Cartwright?" Miss Marple asked mildly, her blue eyes wide and innocent. "A problem? Good heavens, no. Just inconsistencies in the recording. Some figures that require clarification. Nothing I cannot sort out before Mr. Frost arrives." He patted the ledger with a proprietary air, effectively ending the conversation. "Now, if you ladies will excuse me, I have a charity to run." As they left, Miss Marple glanced back at the visitor's book. It sat in the gloom of the hall, silently holding its decades of names. It was a repository of routine. But routine, as Miss Marple knew from long experience in St. Mary Mead, is exactly what makes a deviation visible. The book was waiting. Chapter 2, A Warden's Last Round. Mr. Roland Cartwright was a creature of absolute method. His daily routine at the Hardwick Almshouses varied so little you could set the parish clock by his movements. He took his breakfast of toast and tea at precisely 7:30, walked the perimeter of the cottages at 8 to inspect for loose tiles or unweeded beds, and settled into the accounts room by 9. He was deeply proud of the almshouses and deeply proprietary about the charity's accounts. To him, columns of figures were not merely numbers, they were a moral ledger, a testament to order and rectitude. The residents, a collection of mostly octogenarians, regarded him with a mixture of respect and mild exasperation. He was fair, but he was inflexible. And recently, he had been more inflexible than usual. He had begun to notice something wrong. He hadn't named it yet, even to himself, because naming it would mean acknowledging a betrayal he found unthinkable. It was there, hidden in the mundane flutter of the Flower Fund receipts. The charity provided a modest sum for the upkeep of the church flowers, an arrangement that had existed for 50 years. But as Cartwright cross-referenced the recent receipts with the historical ledgers, a discrepancy emerged. It was not a glaring error, but a subtle erosion. A few pounds here, a missing voucher there. That afternoon, after the residents had retired for their post-lunch rest, Cartwright pulled the relevant ledger. The accounts room was quiet, filled with the dusty, golden light of late afternoon. It smelled of floor wax and old paper. The disorder of his careful system was evident only to him, a stack of receipts sitting slightly askew, a pencil left uncapped. He laid the heavy ledger open on his large oak desk. He placed the stack of flower fund receipts beside it. He adjusted his reading glasses. For hours, he traced the numbers. He worked in real time, his finger moving slowly down the columns. He paused. He picked up a receipt dated 3 months prior, holding it up to the light as if the watermark might explain the anomaly. He set it against the ledger entry. He frowned. The frown deepened into a scowl of profound disappointment. He pulled another receipt, then another. The pattern was undeniable. Someone was skimming the fund, masking the theft with inflated invoices and shifted dates. He was disturbed. He reached for the heavy black telephone on his desk and dialed the vicarage. The rotary dial whirred back into place. It rang once, twice, 3 times. St. Bartholomew's Vicarage, a polite voice finally answered. It was the vicar's wife, Sylvia. Mrs. Ketch. This is Cartwright, he said, his voice tight. Is the vicar available? I'm afraid Nigel is out visiting the sick, Mr. Cartwright. Can I help you with something? Cartwright hesitated. His pride and his suspicion held him back. He needed certainty, absolute undeniable proof, before he spoke to the woman whose committee was responsible for the missing funds. No. No, it can wait. Please tell him I called. He hung up. He considered speaking to someone else on the committee, but he intended to have the matter entirely unraveled before Gerald Frost, the diocesan inspector, even opened his briefcase the next morning. Evening fell over Brinely Magna. The almshouse courtyard grew quiet, shadows stretching long across the flagstones. The air cooled rapidly, and one by one, the lights in the small cottages flicked on, casting warm yellow squares onto the pavement. At 7 o'clock, Mrs. Tabbitt, one of the oldest residents, wrapped her cardigan tightly around herself and stepped out into the courtyard. She had a dripping tap in her kitchen, and Mr. Cartwright was strict about reporting maintenance issues promptly. She made her way to the accounts room and tapped lightly on the door. There was no answer. Mr. Cartwright, she called softly. She tapped again, slightly louder. Still nothing. Mrs. Tabbitt hesitated. It was unlike the warden to leave his door unlocked if he wasn't inside, and unlike him to ignore a knock if he was. With a trembling hand, she turned the brass knob and pushed the door open. Mr. Cartwright was lying on the floor, near the desk. His reading glasses were thrown clear, resting near the skirting board. One hand was clutched to his chest. He was quite dead. Mrs. Tabbitt let out a short, high gasp, clapping her hands over her mouth. She backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs, and then turned and hurried to Mrs. Hadley's cottage to raise the alarm. The doctor, arriving hastily half an hour later, pronounced it a heart attack. He knelt beside the body, a worn leather bag open beside him. He was 71, the doctor told the police constable who had been summoned as a formality. His heart was never robust. The stress of the upcoming inspection, perhaps. It happens. The ledger remained open on the desk. The receipts were neatly stacked. Everything appeared perfectly natural. A tragic, sudden end to a dedicated life. But out in the entrance hall, the visitor's book held a different record. Someone had signed it that afternoon, after hours. Someone who had a reason to visit the almshouses when the residents were resting and the warden was alone with his books. Miss Marple, who had heard the news from Mrs. Hadley and stood quietly at the edge of the courtyard watching the commotion, thought of the open ledger. She thought of the visitor's book in the hall. She wondered, quietly, what Cartwright had seen in those numbers that had brought his heart to a stop. Chapter 3: The Flower Fund. Mrs. Sylvia Ketch was the sort of woman who formed the backbone of any parish. She was the vicar's wife, but she was more than that, she was the indispensable engine of St. Bartholomew's. When Miss Marple and Mrs. Hadley visited the church the next morning, the air inside was thick with the smell of damp stone, floor polish, and the sharp, green scent of cut chrysanthemums. Dust motes danced in the columns of light slanting through the stained glass windows. Sylvia was already busy at the font, arranging a large display. She was outwardly mild, her face lined with the comfortable fatigue of someone who gives endlessly of her time. She was well-liked, competent, and possessed a slightly theatrical humility that made people feel they were imposing on a saint. She wore a sensible tweed skirt and a cardigan that had seen better days, and her hands moved among the flowers with swift, practiced efficiency. "It is so tragic about poor Mr. Cartwright," Sylvia said, clipping a thick green stem with a sharp snap of her secateurs. "Nigel is quite devastated. We all are. He was such a pillar of the community. Always so dedicated to the almshouses." "You must have known him well, Mrs. Ketch," Miss Marple observed, her voice fluttery and innocent as she admired a particularly large white bloom. "Through the flower committee, I imagine." "Oh, yes." Sylvia stepped back to assess her work, wiping her hands on an apron. "I've chaired the committee for 8 years now. Before that, well, I've always been involved. The almshouse provides the fund, you see. It's a very old bequest. Mr. Cartwright and I worked closely to ensure the church always looked its best for the glory of God. It was a heavy responsibility, but one I was glad to bear." She spoke with the easy authority of someone who owns her domain. Her hands moved swiftly among the flowers, creating order out of a tangle of stems. Miss Marple watched her intently. She noted the competence. She noted the warmth. And she noted the absolute lack of unease. A man she worked closely with had died suddenly the night before, yet her hands did not tremble. Her grief was perfectly articulated, but perhaps a little too perfectly rehearsed. The history of the Flower Committee was not without its frictions. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the almshouses. The atmosphere was subdued, the residents moving quietly, speaking in hushed tones. Miss Marple had volunteered to sit with some of them, offering a sympathetic ear in the wake of the warden's death. It was an excellent excuse to be present. While Mrs. Hadley was busy organizing tea in the communal lounge, Miss Marple lingered in the entrance hall. The afternoon light cast long, sad shadows across the oak panels. She stepped up to the mahogany table. She opened the visitor's book again. This time, she was deliberate. She traced the entries backward, turning the heavy pages with a soft rustle. Sylvia Ketch's signature appeared with rhythmic regularity. Consistent, neat, frequent. Too frequent, perhaps, for someone whose only business was the flower fund. What requires a weekly, sometimes bi-weekly, visit for 15 years? Snooping, are we?" Miss Marple turned. Standing in the doorway was Miss Effie Blunt. She was a tall, angular woman with a face that looked as though it had been carved from something unyielding and then left out in the rain. She wore a severe grey coat and carried a walking stick which she struck against the floor for emphasis. She had been the long-standing chair of the Flower Committee until Sylvia displaced her 8 years ago. Her resentment was plain, her manner sharp enough to cut glass. Just admiring the history of the place, Miss Marple said gently, offering a warm smile. "It is so important to keep records. They tell such interesting stories." "Records?" Miss Effie snorted, marching into the hall. Roland Cartwright was obsessed with records. Much good it did him. He was poking his nose where it didn't belong. "Oh." Miss Marple's eyes widened. "Where was that?" "The Flower Fund," Miss Effie said, her voice dropping to a harsh, conspiratorial whisper. "He was asking questions last week. Questions about the receipts. He wouldn't listen to me years ago when I told him Sylvia Ketch was taking over too much. Saint Sylvia, everyone calls her. But she's just a woman who likes control. And money. She ousted me, you know. Said I was too old to manage the displays. But it wasn't the displays she wanted to manage. It was the purse strings." Miss Effie turned and marched away toward the lounge, her stick clicking sharply on the flagstones. Miss Marple looked back at the visitor's book. The entries marched down the page, a testament to Sylvia's constant presence. Miss Marple closed the book softly. Miss Effie's genuine grievances were obvious, making her a perfect secondary red herring, a woman blinded by spite. But spite often illuminates what admiration obscures. Miss Marple felt the cold weight of the leather cover under her hand. The book knew the truth. It was just a matter of reading it correctly. Chapter 4: Mr. Frost's Visit. Gerald Frost arrived precisely at 9 o'clock the morning after Cartwright's death. He was a charity inspector from the diocesan board, a man whose entire personality seemed constructed from grey wool and carefully sharpened pencils. He wore a suit that was neither fashionable nor unfashionable, carried a battered leather briefcase that looked as heavy as a cornerstone, and wore an expression of professional non-committal. He was directed to the accounts room, which the local constable had obligingly left untouched since the body was removed. Frost set his briefcase on a side table with a solid thud. He surveyed the room, the open ledger still on the desk, the neat stack of receipts beside it, the pencil Cartwright had dropped. He took out a notepad and began his work with a quiet, devastating thoroughness, comparing figures, checking dates, and muttering to himself in a dry, rustling whisper. That same afternoon, the subdued atmosphere at the almshouses was further disturbed by the arrival of Gordon Cartwright. He was the dead warden's estranged nephew, a man in his 40s who burst into the courtyard like a sudden storm. He smelled faintly of stale tobacco, a long train journey, and older, unwashed grievances. His suit was rumpled, his eyes darting and angry. He marched straight to the accounts room and threw open the door. "Where is it?" he demanded loudly. "Where's the will? I have a right to know what the old miser left me." Mr. Frost looked up, entirely unruffled. "This room is currently under inspection. You will have to leave." "I'm his nephew," Gordon shouted, his face reddening. "I'm his only living relative. He cut me out over a miserable strip of land 5 years ago, but he owed me." "He owed me?" "Out," Frost said simply, gesturing to the door. Gordon, swearing profusely, was ejected. He retreated to the communal lounge, pacing angrily and complaining to the frightened residents about his uncle's cruelty. He was clearly bitter, conspicuously aggressive, and immediately became the inspector's primary suspect once it became clear that Cartwright's death might not have been entirely natural. Miss Marple could hear him fuming through the thin walls. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat in the entrance hall. She had appointed herself unofficial company for the elderly residents, taking up a position in a high-backed chair near the door. The hall was cold, and she had her pink shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She sat in absolute stillness, knitting her shapeless garment, observing the movement of people past her. Mr. Frost stepping out to ask for a cup of tea. Mrs. Hadley bustling by with fresh towels. While the inspector worked, and while Gordon Cartwright fumed in the next room, Miss Marple set down her knitting. She reached over and pulled the visitor's book onto her lap. She did not flip through it idly this time. She read it slowly, deliberately, tracing the years backward, page by heavy page. She was looking for the seam. The place where the fabric of deception was stitched. She turned a page. And then another. She found it 11 years back. It was a small thing. 3 entries in Sylvia Ketch's neat handwriting. They were signed, like all the others, indicating her visit for the flower committee. But these 3 entries were written in ballpoint pen. Miss Marple stopped. She ran her finger over the ink. It lacked the slight indentation of a fountain pen nib, the ink sat flat on the page, the color a hard, unvarying blue. She remembered a conversation from just yesterday, at the church, while Sylvia was arranging the chrysanthemums. Sylvia had been complaining about a smudged parish newsletter. "I despise ballpoint pens, Sylvia had said, holding up her fingers in distaste. "I have never owned one. I only ever use my blue-black fountain pen. It's a matter of principle. Ballpoints are so terribly untidy. Miss Marple looked closely at the 3 signatures. The handwriting was a perfect imitation of Sylvia's, the loops, the slant, all correct, but the ink was undeniably ballpoint. The pressure was different. The flow was wrong. Someone had forged Sylvia's signature. Or, more likely, Sylvia had forged it herself, having forgotten, in a moment of panic or haste, her own rigid rule about ink. Perhaps she had needed to add an entry quickly, snatching whatever pen was available from the warden's desk, not realizing until later that the ink itself was a betrayal. Miss Marple closed the book slowly. She placed it back on the mahogany table. She said nothing. She picked up her knitting. She knew that to speak now would only alert the quarry. The inspector was busy chasing the noisy nephew, but Miss Marple knew that the loudest suspect is rarely the most dangerous. The real danger lay in the quiet, perfect records. She needed to understand the shape of the 15 years before she could expose the ink. Chapter 5: 15 Years of Flowers. The process of unearthing the past requires a delicate touch. Miss Marple did not interrogate, she conversed. She constructed the narrative from fragments, piecing together the history of the parish like a complex patchwork quilt. It began at breakfast the next morning with Mrs. Hadley. Over toast and marmalade, Miss Marple casually inquired about the Ketch family's early days in Brinely Magna. "They seemed so settled," she observed. "Have they always been so comfortable?" "Oh, goodness no," Mrs. Hadley replied, buttering a second piece of toast vigorously. "When they first arrived, they had barely a penny to rub together. The stipend is very small, you know. And they had a terrible scare with their daughter. Madeline." Miss Marple let the name hang in the air, filing it away. Later, she wandered into the almshouse kitchen, where the cook, a stout woman named Brenda, was preparing tea. Over the rattle of cups, Miss Marple asked about the flower displays. "They used to be much grander, Miss Effie told me," she murmured. Brenda snorted. "Miss Effie has a sharp tongue, but she's not wrong. Used to be lilies from London. Now it's mostly greenery from the vicarage garden. Still, Mrs. Ketch does her best with what she has." But the most revealing conversation came that afternoon with Mrs. Tabot. Miss Marple found the elderly resident in her small, neat room, which was crammed with photographs and smelled of mint imperials. Mrs. Tabot possessed the sharp, unforgiving memory of someone whose world has shrunk to a very small circumference, making every past event within it intensely significant. "It's a shame about Mr. Cartwright," Mrs. Tabot said, offering Miss Marple a mint. "But he was a hard man. Not like the vicar. And Mrs. Ketch, well, she's a saint, isn't she? Always so kind. Always visiting." "She must work very hard," Miss Marple prompted gently, accepting the sweet. "Has she always been so involved? I understand she had some trouble years ago." "Oh, yes. Just terrible." Mrs. Tabot leaned closer, her voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper. "Her daughter, Madeline. A sweet girl, but she got terribly ill. Some rare condition, they said. Her immune system attacking itself. The NHS couldn't do anything. Needed treatments in Switzerland, or some such place. It cost a fortune." "How dreadful for a mother," Miss Marple murmured. "To watch your child suffer and not have the means." "It was heartbreaking," Mrs. Tabot recalled, her eyes misting slightly. 15 years ago, that must have been. They were desperate. I remember Mrs. Ketch coming here one afternoon, looking so drawn, so frantic. Like a ghost. She sat right in that chair you're in now and just wept. And then, somehow, a few weeks later, they managed it. The girl got the treatment. She got better, eventually. But the strain, it changes a person, Miss Marple. It leaves a mark." Miss Marple listened. She did not press for more details. She had what she needed. As she walked back to the entrance hall, her interior process of reconstruction clicked into place. The narrative assembled itself with tragic clarity. She understood now. The slow curdling of desperation into habit. 15 years ago, a mother faces the unthinkable prospect of losing her child for want of money. She is desperate, frantic. She has access to the church flower fund, sitting relatively unscrutinized in the almshouse accounts. It presents a temporary solution. She takes a sum, perhaps £800, intending, with all her heart, to repay it. She tells herself it is merely a loan. A temporary necessary sin to save a life. But the year passes, and the money is not repaid. The vicar's stipend doesn't stretch. The next year makes it harder. The fear of discovery necessitates further manipulation of the accounts to hide the initial shortfall. She begins to alter the flower displays, using cheaper foliage to cover the missing funds. She ousts Effie Blunt to ensure no one else sees the receipts. And each year, the act of theft becomes less an emergency and more a routine. The intention to repay fades, replaced by the mundane, exhausting necessity of balancing the books to hide the discrepancy. It is a terrible philosophical trap. The initial act was born of profound love, but the maintenance of the lie requires cold, calculated deceit. It was not a grand, villainous scheme. It was an ordinary theft that had grown too large to stop, trapping the thief in a prison of her own making. The visitor's book held the evidence, not of a master criminal, but of a woman who had spent 15 years covering her tracks, one careful signature at a time. Chapter 6: The Razored Page. Late the following afternoon, the entrance hall of the almshouse was entirely empty. The residents had retreated to their cottages for their tea, and Mr. Frost was locked in the accounts room, wrestling with the historical ledgers. The atmosphere in the hall was heavy and silent, save for the distant, muffled ticking of the grandfather clock in the lounge. The late autumn sun slanted through the tall, narrow stained-glass window by the door, casting a harsh, raking light across the polished mahogany table and the motes of dust dancing in the air. Miss Marple stood alone by the table. She reached out and opened the visitor's book. She did not look at the ink this time, nor the names. She looked at the physical structure of the book itself. The way the pages fell, the stiffness of the binding. She turned to the approximate year she had been interested in, 12 years ago, a period when the embezzlement, if her theory was correct, would have required the most frantic covering up as the initial loan became a permanent structural deficit in the accounts. She picked the heavy book up in both hands. She moved slowly, adjusting her angle until she held it so the raking afternoon light fell directly across the open spine. She bent closer, her eyes narrowing. The binding was tight, the stitching generally neat. But there, between the entries for the first week of November and the second, the light caught something unnatural. It was a thin, barely perceptible line of hardened glue along the gutter of the spine. It caught the light with a faint, glossy sheen against the matte paper. Miss Marple held her breath. She touched the spot gently with her fingertip, feeling the slight ridge. A page had been removed. It had been carefully razored out, right at the binding, and a new page tipped back in, glued with meticulous precision. It was a flawless piece of work, invisible to anyone casually flipping through, invisible to Roland Cartwright in the dim light of his office. It was only visible now, under the unforgiving angle of the dying sun. She stood perfectly still, controlling her reaction. The sheer nerve required to mutilate the official record book in the warden's own hall was staggering. She did not alert the inspector. She did not call for Mrs. Hadley. She simply noted the exact dates covering the substituted page, November 3rd to November 9th. Later that evening, after supper, under the pretext of looking up an old friend's grave, she asked the vicar if she might consult the church burial registers, of which the almshouse kept copies in a small cabinet in the lounge. The vestry was cold, smelling of old damp and hymn books. She pulled the heavy register for the year in question. She ran her finger down the columns, cross-referencing the dates. The missing original page of the visitor's book would have shown who truly came and went during that specific week in November. The substituted page, the forged page, showed Sylvia Ketch visiting the almshouse twice for flower committee business. Why replace a page just to show you were there? Miss Marple stood in the cold vestry, considering the possibilities. Perhaps the original page showed someone else visiting who could have exposed her? Unlikely. Perhaps it showed she wasn't there at all when a crucial financial transaction was recorded? Yes, that was plausible. Or perhaps, most damning of all, it showed she was there on a day she later claimed to the committee to be elsewhere, perhaps in London arranging the expensive medical treatments. The razored page was a silent scream of panic, frozen in paper. It was the act of someone who realized, after the fact, that the official, unalterable record did not support their lie, and took desperate, physical measures to alter reality itself. The perfection of the repair was the proof of the crime. It was the act of a woman terrified of being caught. Chapter 7. What the Handwriting Knows. Miss Marple spent the whole of the next afternoon sitting in the draughty entrance hall, her pink shawl pulled tight against the chill. The light changed slowly from bright gold to a bruised purple as the afternoon wore on. Residents shuffled past, offering polite nods. The postman arrived and departed. Through it all, Miss Marple sat in her high-backed chair, the heavy visitor's book resting on her lap. She went through it entry by entry, spanning the entire 15-year period. She was no longer looking for anomalies in ink or binding, she was looking for a pattern in the language. She read thousands of entries. She noted the rhythms, the doctor every Tuesday, the grocer on Thursdays. And she noted the progression of Sylvia Ketch's reason for visit entries. For the first 7 years, the earliest entries, Sylvia had consistently written, "Flower Committee." It was a standard, unvarying phrase, repeated week after week, month after month. It spoke of meetings, of shared responsibility. Then, she found the transition. Exactly 8 years ago, around the time Sylvia had ousted Effie Blunt and taken full control, the phrase shifted. Miss Marple ran her finger down the page. Flower Committees in October. Flower Committee in November. Then, in December, Flower Fund. For the next 3 years, the period when Miss Marple suspected the embezzlement had grown largest and most complex, the entry remained exclusively Flower Fund. It was a subtle shift. Flower Committee implied a gathering of people, a collective decision. Flower Fund implied administration, dealing directly with the money alone. It mirrored the exact shift in the account ledger headings that Cartwright must have noticed, the move from collective oversight to unilateral financial control. This phrase shift was the second clue. It was easy to overlook, the kind of semantic drift that happens naturally over time. But Miss Marple knew that in a mind focused on deception, language often betrays the underlying reality. You write what you are thinking about. She remembered a woman in St. Mary Mead, a Mrs. Higgins, who had kept the account book for the village fete for 12 years. Mrs. Higgins was fiercely proud of her accounts. Every entry was perfect, flawless, not a single crossed-out line. But someone had eventually noticed that the handwriting in a single column regarding the tombola receipts had subtly changed, the slant of the letters just slightly more upright. Mrs. Higgins had been copying over her own old records to hide a discrepancy. The perfection, the rigid consistency, was the giveaway, because real accounts, like real life, have corrections, crossings out, and minor variations. Sylvia's rigid adherence to her script, followed by a sudden, sustained shift that matched her taking control of the money, was a mirror of her actions. As Miss Marple pondered this, the heavy front door banged open. Gordon Cartwright stormed into the hall, nearly knocking over a small table. He was red-faced and furious, closely followed by a remarkably calm Mr. Frost. "You can't prove anything," Gordon shouted, his voice echoing off the oak panels. "I was at the pub." "Ask the barman." "We have asked him, Mr. Cartwright," Frost said mildly. "He remembers you leaving for an hour. Around the time your uncle died." "I went for a walk," Gordon yelled, looking wildly around the hall as if seeking support from the walls. "I didn't kill him. I wanted his money, yes, but I didn't kill him." Gordon's violent intrusion provided a stark contrast to Miss Marple's quiet focus. He was loud, messy, and obvious. Miss Marple watched him storm off towards the lounge. She knew Gordon was merely a distraction, a loud noise hiding a quiet truth. The real story was written in blue-black ink on the pages in her lap, spanning 15 years of quiet, desperate administration. Chapter 8. Gordon Cartwright's Grievance. The ripple of anxiety through the almshouse turned into a wave of palpable fear the next morning. The local police sergeant arrived, looking grim, and conferred quietly with Mr. Frost in the courtyard. The news spread rapidly. The second medical opinion, conducted at the morgue in the county town, had confirmed Frost's suspicions. Cartwright had not died of a simple heart attack. There were faint petechial hemorrhages in his eyes and slight bruising around his mouth and nose. He had been smothered. The stress of the struggle had triggered the fatal cardiac arrest. It was murder. Gordon Cartwright was immediately hauled into the communal lounge for a full interrogation. Frost, flanked by the police sergeant, sat opposite the sweating nephew. The elderly residents huddled in the corridors, listening intently. "You admit you were angry about the will," Frost said, his voice carrying clearly through the thin door. "I was furious." Gordon shot back. "He stole my inheritance." "And you admit you left the pub for an hour, during which time your uncle was killed." "I was walking. I needed air." Gordon's voice cracked with panic. "Look, I hated the old man, but I wouldn't smother him. I don't have the stomach for it." The inspector's theory was assembling itself step by step. Gordon confronts Cartwright, demands money, is refused, and in a rage, attacks the old man. It was plausible. It was neat. Miss Marple left them to it. She walked out of the almshouse gates and made her way down the lane to Miss Effie Blunt's cottage. Effie's cottage was small, overstuffed with heavy Victorian furniture, and smelled overwhelmingly of damp wool and cats. 3 large tabbies watched Miss Marple suspiciously from various perches. Over cups of tea so strong a spoon could nearly stand up in them, Effie expanded on her grievances. "The police are wasting their time with that nephew," Effie declared, slapping her hand on the table. "He hasn't got the brains to murder anyone and get away with it. No, it's the quiet ones you have to watch. I told Cartwright. I told him." "Told him what, exactly, Effie?" Miss Marple asked softly, stroking a cat that had bravely approached her skirt. "About Sylvia taking over. 8 years ago, she just pushed me out. Said my arthritis was getting too bad to manage the displays. But it wasn't the displays. It was the receipts. I used to keep the receipts, you see. I handed them to Cartwright. But Sylvia insisted she should do it all to save me the trouble. And I'll tell you something else, Jane." Effie leaned in, her eyes glittering with malice and triumph. "The fund allocation from the charity never went down. It stayed exactly the same. But the flowers, they changed. We used to have arum lilies from London for Easter. Beautiful things. Lately? Ivy and local chrysanthemums. Cheaper. Much cheaper. Where did the difference go?" Miss Marple sipped her tea. The insight Effie provided was the final piece of the financial puzzle. Sylvia had monopolized the process, allowing her to skim the funds and cover the shortfall by reducing the quality of the flowers. It was simple, effective, and entirely dependent on no one ever looking too closely at the paperwork. She had managed it for 15 years. Until Roland Cartwright, meticulous, unyielding Roland Cartwright, started looking. And that was why he had to die. Chapter 9, The Date That Doesn't Add. The final confirmation required a comparison of records. Miss Marple knew she needed to see the actual flower receipts Frost had impounded. She approached Mr. Frost in the hallway later that afternoon. She employed her most effective performance, the befuddled, harmless old lady. She fluttered her hands. She dropped a ball of pink wool at his feet. She apologized profusely. "Oh, Mr. Frost, I am so sorry to bother you," she chirped as he retrieved the wool. "But I seem to have lost a receipt for some knitting patterns I bought for the residents. I thought perhaps I dropped it in the accounts room. I know you've collected all the papers." Frost sighed, his tolerant manner stretched thin. "I have only collected the charity receipts, Miss Marple. There are no knitting patterns. Could I just peep? Just to be sure?" It was a blue slip of paper? Frost, eager to be rid of her, allowed her to stand by the desk while he shuffled through a folder of recent receipts. As you can see, nothing blue. Only the florist invoices. Miss Marple's eyes darted across the papers. She didn't need long. She found what she was looking for in seconds. She memorized the date and the invoice number. "Silly me," she said, beaming. "I must have left it in my room. Thank you so much, Mr. Frost." She retreated to the hall and quickly cross-referenced the receipt date against her notes from the visitor's book. She was looking specifically for the entries around the time Cartwright had begun his audit 2 months ago. And there it was. The third clue. The fatal error. Sylvia Ketch's alibi for the night Cartwright died relied heavily on the visitor's book. She claimed she had visited the almshouse in the afternoon to discuss the Sunday display, signed the book, and then gone home to the vicarage, remaining there all evening. The signature in the book, dated that Tuesday afternoon, seemed to confirm her presence during normal hours, long before Cartwright was killed. But Miss Marple looked at her notes. One visitor's book entry from 2 months prior showed Sylvia signing in on a Tuesday. The stated reason, flower fund delivery. But the florist's receipt Miss Marple had just seen in Frost's folder was dated Wednesday. The florist's receipt was a commercial document, stamped by the shop. It was the real date. The visitor's book entry for Tuesday was false. To be absolutely certain, Miss Marple made one final trip to the vestry. She pulled the St. Bartholomew's funeral register for that specific Tuesday 2 months ago. The heavy pages fell open. The record showed that Sylvia Ketch had officiated as the lead flower arranger and coordinator for a major funeral service for a prominent local family all day that Tuesday. She had been at the church from dawn until dusk. She could not possibly have been at the almshouse signing the visitor's book. Miss Marple sat in the cold vestry, assembling the pieces. The entry was forged after the fact, backdated to cover a gap in her narrative, perhaps to justify a receipt that she had forgotten to log on the actual day she obtained the money. This proved one crucial thing: Sylvia was willing and able to manipulate the visitor's book dates to support her financial fictions. Which meant her alibi for the night of Cartwright's murder, the Tuesday signature proving she was there in the afternoon and not the evening, was entirely worthless. The book was not a record of truth, it was the ledger of her lies. The razored page, the ballpoint ink, the phrase shift, and now the impossible date. The book was shouting her guilt. It was a monument to 15 years of terrified, meticulous deception, and it was about to fall. Chapter 10: A Quiet Conversation in the Garden. Miss Marple found Sylvia in the almshouse garden the following morning. The air was crisp, holding the damp, sharp chill of an English autumn. The sky was a pale, watery blue. Sylvia was methodically deadheading the late-blooming roses in the courtyard, her movements precise and unhurried. The sharp snip of her secateurs was the only sound. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves was strong. Miss Marple sat on a wooden bench nearby. She arranged her shawl. For a time, she said nothing, allowing the rhythm of the clipping to fill the silence. She watched Sylvia's face, calm, focused, entirely ordinary. "It is so difficult to keep roses blooming this late in the year," Miss Marple began gently, her voice breaking the quiet. "The damp gets into them. They look perfect on the outside, but the rot starts at the center." Sylvia paused, a dead rose held between her gloved fingers. She didn't look back. "Yes. It takes constant attention. You have to remove the dead wood so the rest can survive." "Attention to detail is so important," Miss Marple agreed, leaning forward slightly. "Like keeping accounts. Or a visitor's book." Sylvia's hand stopped moving. The secateurs hovered over a stem. Mr. Cartwright was very particular about the book. He was. But even the most particular men can miss things. A change in phrasing, for instance. From "Flower Committee" to "A Flower Fund." So subtle. But it marks a change in authority, doesn't it? The moment you took the money entirely into your own hands. Sylvia's shoulders went rigid beneath her tweed jacket. She did not turn around. "An ink," Miss Marple continued, her voice soft, conversational, relentless. "You told me you never use ballpoint pens. A matter of principle. Yet, 11 years ago, you signed the book 3 times in ballpoint. One forgets one's principles when one is in a hurry to cover a mistake, or to forge a signature you forgot to make." Sylvia turned slowly. Her face was pale, the color drained entirely away, but her expression remained composed. "Miss Marple, what are you saying?" "I am talking about a woman I knew in St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple said, looking directly into Sylvia's eyes. "A Mrs. Higgins. She kept the fate accounts perfectly for 12 years. So perfectly that the perfection itself was the lie. She copied them over to hide what she had taken. You razed a page out of that book, Sylvia. You replaced it to hide a visit you couldn't explain. And you backdated an entry 2 months ago for a Tuesday when you were actually at a funeral all day. Your alibi for the night Mr. Cartwright died is written in a book that tells nothing but lies. There was no drama in the garden. No sudden confession, no tearful breakdown, no attempt to run." Sylvia Ketch stood very still, holding the dead-headed roses in her gloved hand. Her confession was quiet, unhurried, and entirely without self-pity. "It was Madeline," Sylvia said softly, the name escaping her lips like a long-held breath. "The treatments in Switzerland were so expensive. Nigel's stipend, we had nothing. I only took £800 that first year. I meant to put it back. Before God, Miss Marple, I meant to put it back. I thought we could save, scrape it together." "I know," Miss Marple said, her voice filled with a terrible, understanding pity. "But the year passed. And the next. It became a habit," Sylvia whispered, staring at the ground. "A terrible, necessary habit. The intention to repay never left me, but it became like a ghost. I spent 15 years moving numbers, changing dates, lying to Effie, lying to Nigel. And then Roland started looking at the ledgers last week. He saw the pattern. I knew he had. I went to him that evening, after hours, to beg him to let me repay it. To give me time. But he wouldn't listen. He was so rigid. He said it was theft, plain and simple. He was going to call the inspector immediately. He reached for the phone. Sylvia closed her eyes. I tried to stop him. I just wanted him to listen. I put my hand over his mouth to stop him shouting. He panicked. He fought me. And then his eyes went wide, and he just stopped. His heart gave out. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted to keep the secret. The horror of the scene lay not in its violence, but in its absolute ordinariness. A vicar's wife, desperate to maintain her fiction, terrifying an old man to death to protect her 15-year lie. You should speak to Mr. Frost yourself, Miss Marple said gently. Before he reaches you by other means. It is the only thing left to do. Sylvia nodded slowly. She looked at the dead roses in her hand, then dropped them into her trug. She took off her gardening gloves, folding them neatly. Thank you, Jane, she said, her voice steady. She turned and walked back inside the almshouse, a woman finally stepping out of a 15-year shadow, walking towards her own ruin. Chapter 11. What Remains? The inspector's official conclusion was delivered in the accounts room later that afternoon. Mr. Frost sat behind the desk, surrounded by the ledgers that had caused so much grief, and officially closed his investigation into Gordon Cartwright. The local sergeant stood by the door. Sylvia Ketch had walked directly from the garden to the police station in the market square. She gave a voluntary, comprehensive statement to the desk sergeant, detailing every altered receipt, every false entry, every desperate measure taken over 15 years, and exactly what happened in Cartwright's office. Frost, arriving later, found her sitting quietly in an interview room. The perfection of her confession matched the perfection of her fraud. She left nothing out. The fallout was swift and devastating. Reverend Nigel Ketch, who had known absolutely nothing of his wife's activities, was left a broken man. Miss Marple saw him briefly in the courtyard the next day. He looked 10 years older, his shoulders bowed, his face grey. He was facing the task of reconstructing his life and explaining to his parish that the woman they thought a saint was a thief and a killer. He resigned his position by the end of the week. Gordon Cartwright, cleared of suspicion but slightly deflated by the lack of a grand conspiracy against him, caught the next train back to London. He carried his small suitcase through the courtyard, his grievances intact but entirely irrelevant to the tragedy that had unfolded. Miss Effie Blunt, rather too publicly and too often, told anyone who would listen in the post office and the butcher's shop that she had always had a feeling about Sylvia. Miss Marple, passing her in the square, merely offered a tight, ironic smile. Effie had been right for entirely the wrong reasons. The Hardwick almshouses remained open. The residents, most of whom were in their 80s and had survived wars, rationing, and the loss of almost everyone they knew, took the news with a particular variety of stoicism. "It's a terrible thing," Mrs. Tabbitt said to Miss Marple as they sat in the communal lounge on Miss Marple's final morning. "To think she did all that for her daughter. And then to kill Mr. Cartwright, well, it shows you never really know anyone, does it? But she did keep the church looking lovely. I suppose someone else will have to do the flowers now. Will you stay for the week, Miss Marple? They'll need arranging for Sunday." Miss Marple declined gracefully, citing her train schedule. As she prepared to leave Brinely Magna, she stood one last time in the cold, oak-panelled entrance hall. The morning light was pale and clear. The visitor's book sat on its mahogany table by the door, silent and heavy. It had absorbed a lifetime of lies, recorded the daily movements of a desperate woman, and finally given up its secrets to someone who knew how to read the spaces between the words. Miss Marple took out her fountain pen. She unscrewed the cap. She found the next blank line in the book. She signed out, Jane Marple, guest, visiting, in her small, neat hand, using blue-black ink. She blotted it carefully. She closed the heavy leather cover with a soft thud. She noted, without comment, that her page was real and walked out into the crisp morning air. I'm Jack, this is Midnight Pages from Ohio, and I'll be back next time with another story from the quiet side of the shelf. Leave a comment and tell me, at what point did you realize the dates in the story were the key? I'd love to know. Good night.